Hi and welcome to another video. I've had a request from Brian, which let me just open this image for you, to do with creation of a survey profile and then have a number of related questions that's then related. So the survey profile, each account will choose an individual survey profile and have their own copy of the questions displayed on a subgrid that you can obviously open each row and record the response, and then a requirement then to, if the survey profile's changed, what I was looking to do is delete the existing questions and responses if it's a different survey profile selected, and also if they modify the existing questions within a survey profile, add to or delete, that it also reflects that in any associated accounts that are using that survey profile. So that's, I think, the gist of what Brian was looking for. If I minimize, well, I'll open a new tab and I'll go to my demo CRM. I've spent a few hours on this yesterday evening, just because it was fairly complex and wanted to ensure that my methods would work. So if I go to an account record, open any account, there's this additional lookup now for survey profile, which will allow you to select a single profile. And then in the settings area, I have a survey profiles area and a questions area. If I click on survey profiles, I've just done some ones to play around with. So I've done one called survey about cars and one about survey about dogs. That is cars, by the way, not cats. So if I open that particular profile, all it contains is a single primary field, which is the name, and related to it, obviously you could see any accounts that were using that profile and also what questions are asked. So at the moment I'll just put a couple in, and that's favourite colour for your car and whether you want petrol, diesel or liquid propane gas, which I don't know if some of you guys will have in your country of origin. So that's the sort of principle. If I open a particular question, it's just got the question as text and which survey profile it relates to. So if I then go into my Visual Studio, open my solution. So this is going to be sort of two parts to the solution. There'll be a plugin that's triggered on the create or update of an account. So when so if I go to an account just to show you, so if I open one of these dummy accounts, when you update this field, oh, that didn't open. When you update the survey profile field, we'll obviously need a plugin that will go away, retrieve the survey profile you've selected, and populate the survey I've called the entity survey responses. So that will be a copy. So if of the two questions, for instance, in the car profile, this particular account would have two survey response records with the question and an area where they can type the response in. And there's also a relationship back to the originating question, so the master question, so to speak, the parent question that your copy originated from will be related here. And then obviously they're visible on this subgrid. At the moment it's only, I think, 5 rows visible, but obviously you can play around with your form design. Obviously I'm running my desktop quite low resolution at 720, well, 1280 by 720 for the purposes of the YouTube video, but you'd probably have a bit more desktop real estate to play with on your own monitors. I mean, I typically do, it's a much bigger resolution, but I do this for the purposes of the recording. So if I go back to Visual Studio, what I've done already is created this using the developer toolkit that we looked at in the previous video. So within my solution, under plugin assemblies and under plugins, I'd right click that and chosen add plugin, and then I've chosen the update message. I mean, if I show you the actual step, where's it gone? Post account update. So this is what I've actually configured for the update message. So for this particular plugin, it's going to be on the account entity on an update message in the context of the calling user. The pipeline stage in this instance isn't critical because it doesn't matter if the for the update if it happens before or after the main database operation, because we're going to be adding records or altering records on a related entity, so we're not trying to sort of manipulate values within the actual account itself and pass them through to the main database operation. So I could choose pre-op, I could choose post-operation. I have filtered it down to just the field for the survey profile because I don't want this plugin triggering if they changed any of the other fields like the name or the address or anything. So I've filtered that. Obviously we don't need a pre or post image because we're not looking at values to do with the account itself. It's only the single survey profile field. So if I OK that, obviously we can see if I expand the package, that should have created this section of XML for us. That's obviously already been deployed in my instance because I've been doing some testing with it, and obviously that would have been a blank GUI when we first did the add plugin. That would have been all zeros, and then when we deploy, that will update accordingly. I'll run through this shortly. The other thing we do need is to register on the create, because presumably if they add a new account, there's a good chance they'll pick the survey profile at that point, so it needs to go away and do the same process of retrieving the questions and creating a copy on that survey response entity. So I'll just add that in now. So although the name has been constructed from the update message, I can add an additional step. It won't change the name, but it will still be applicable. So it's going to be on the account, it's going to be on a create. Obviously you can't filter on a create, and again we'll just do it post operation. I mean, in this instance we would need it to be post op so that the account exists, so it's got an actual GUID, so it's more relevant to the create message than it is for the update, because obviously the GUID for the account will already have been generated on a subsequent update. But for a create message we need to have that written to the database before we have a GUID available. So I can, and again it's calling user synchronous, and I can OK that. So that will now have generated additional step within the XML. So we've got this post account create, but what it won't have done is added which we previously looked at in the last video in the constructor, this registered events add method, and it's got the post operation stage and the message and the entity. So I'll need to do that, copy that row, and then change the message to a create. One second. Sorry about that. Yeah, what I've done, because I've been running my Visual Studio previously and elevated privileges under administrator, when I tried to save that just then, it was giving me an access denied because it was under the context of my. So I've just restarted Visual Studio running as administrator, because in order for me to debug on this machine, I have to run the Visual Studio with elevated privileges. So the previous file had been saved with administrative rights, and I obviously couldn't save over it from my account. So anyway, I digress. We've now updated that message to create, and now we're able to deploy to the platform. Okay, so that's deployed. We should have. Yep, that's all deployed now. So now what I'll do is I'll run you through what my business logic within this particular plugin is. So below this to do, which you've seen before on the previous video, I'm doing the same sort of checks where I'm checking for if the input parameters contains a target object and that the type of that is entity. If it is, obviously I've defined this late bound entity variable. I extract that target input parameter and cast it into that late bound type. Otherwise, I return from the plugin and it just ends. Then I cast that to an early bound account type, and obviously because this plugin is only going to be triggered on the one field being changed, we're checking to see if someone's deleted a previous setting. So if it was set to the survey about cars and then they went and deleted the content and saved the records, obviously we don't want to leave a load of orphaned responses, but this will be down to you, your sort of business decision, whether you want to eradicate previous responses, because they'll obviously, once they're deleted and you've lost that history. But the way I've set it is if someone sets that profile ID to null, I've instantiated the organization service context and obviously used the local context organization service for one of the required, well, the only required parameter. Then I use this link statement to query that entity that contains the copy of the questions and responses. So that's the survey response set, where the account ID is equal to the account that's being modified. So the account that's just been triggered in the create or update, I'm querying all responses for that account. I then iterate through each one and delete them using the delete object method, which is part of the organization service context. And then after I've iterated through all those, tracking the delete object in the context, I then do a final save changes, and that actually commits all the deletes. So obviously that will just go through for that particular account any questions that were related to it, questions and responses rather, will get deleted. Then obviously that will then exit, because that will only be that particular chunk of code will only execute if the profile is set to nothing. If it, however, is set to a value, again, I instantiate the organization service context, because obviously this is out of scope because it's part of that if condition. So this piece of code would obviously that wouldn't be available, it'd be out of scope of that block. So I've instantiated the organization service context again, done a very similar query, or identical query, shall I say, where I retrieve all the responses for the particular account. I then, obviously, because this would be a change of the survey, so if someone changes it from the survey about cars to survey about dogs, obviously all the questions that were relevant to the cars, again, we don't want them present, we want them deleted from the system, otherwise you're going to have a bunch of orphaned records. But the way the data grid set up at the moment, it would actually show them, so you'd have questions about dogs and cars, which would just be meaningless. So again, I basically do exactly the same, delete the previous questions. I then retrieve from the questions the question entity. So if I just show you that for clarity. So on this questions entity, this is a list of all questions in the system. So if you had tons of surveys, you'd have all the questions listed. Obviously, some are relevant to the survey about cars, some are to do with the survey about dogs. But the query retrieves any questions that are related to the chosen survey profile for the account. So if it was the survey about cars, it would take the GUID, or sorry, the entity reference for that survey, and query which questions were relevant to the survey about cars. Then iterate through each of those questions, create a new record on that survey response, associate it to the account that's been created or updated, enter the question text as the text from the question entity, and then relate the new survey response record back to the original question. So if I go to a particular account, and I'll just click on the survey response and add a blank one. I won't actually type anything in, but we related it back to the original question here, this source question. And you'll see why I've done that in the next part, which is the workflow. But that was basically iterate through all the questions retrieved that are related to that survey profile. Using the add object method, it will add it to the organization service context to track it. And then finally, after we've iterated through all the questions, we do a save changes, and they'll be committed to the database. So we've now deployed that So I can actually show you that functioning. So if I take this demo account and I pick a survey profile, so I'll pick either one. If I pick the survey about cars, obviously at this point that's not saved, so the plugin hasn't triggered. So if I click save, you'll see there's a small delay as it loads and caches the plugin. That should trigger on the update message, which we then see the grid should refresh. So we've now got an associated survey profile and the 2 questions related to, well, if I click on survey profile there, we can see related to this particular survey there's 2 questions: favourite colour and petrol, diesel or LPG, and they're both present. Obviously you could double click that and put in a response and save and close. Again, for the petrol or diesel we could. So that's obviously just for the one account. Obviously I could do the same for the next account in the list. Pick, in this instance, survey about dogs, click save. The plugin should be a bit quicker this time because it's cached. And then there we go, we can see the 2 big or small, which is a very in-depth question, and favourite breed. And then obviously the next part that we're going to look at, so I'll just quickly recap. So I'm sort of going through this quite quick because I've already done the code, so you're not watching me type it out, which does sometimes help to absorb it. So it's a create or update of an account on one particular field, which is the survey profile field. Do some basic checks to see if the input parameters contains a target object, and if it's an entity type, cast it to an early bound type. If they've blanked the value, actually I haven't shown you that. If I now close that and go back to one of the accounts, so I'll go back up to the first CRM demo account and I just highlight that and delete, so that's now going to be null passed back, and save. You can see that's now deleted any survey responses for that account. Now that may be desirable, it may be something you don't want, but obviously I'll publish this source code. You can manipulate it however you see fit and extend it. It's just to give you a bit of a head start with it. So yeah, that initial chunk, this if statement, is what I've just demonstrated, that if they set it to null, it will then iterate through and delete any survey response records. Then if it's not null, i.e. we've defined a new or we've done it for the first time in a create, or we've changed the survey response, again I can also show you that. So demo workflow account has got survey about dogs and the questions are regarding dogs. If I now change that to survey about cars and save, the first part of that section of code was to delete all the records and then copy in the new questions. So you can see the questions regarding dogs have disappeared. So that's that initial section here where it iterates through the previous responses and deletes them. Again, it's up to you to decide whether you want that to happen or how you want to handle, whether you want to deactivate the records rather than delete them. Then that's the section of code that just retrieves the questions for that survey profile and creates a new copy on the survey response entity for this particular customer. So then in the next part, obviously if they're part of an existing survey profile and you were to alter a question or add a new question, obviously any existing customers' accounts, you'd want them to be updated to reflect the changes or the new question, or in some circumstances you may delete a question and you'd possibly want that to propagate through and remove any instances on any accounts associated to that profile. So the way I was looking to do that, or have done that, is under processes. I've created a workflow that's triggered, it's targeting the questions themselves, and it's fairly straightforward that it's organisation wide when any question is created, when the question itself is modified or the associated survey profile is modified. Obviously I'm not interested in if the ownership of the question changes or anything else. only if someone to reword the question. I want it to obviously go and alter the wording in any associated accounts. I haven't tested what will happen if you alter the survey profile. I mean, ideally you wouldn't. I'd say probably delete the question and recreate it in the other survey profile, but I can demo all this in a minute. So that's the, and also if the question is deleted, it will also trigger this workflow, and the workflow simply contains one custom assembly called survey question, which I'll show you in Visual Studio. So all I did to do this was in my workflows area, project, should I say, I just added a new item, and rather than choosing just a class library and starting from scratch, obviously with the developer toolkit installed you get the additional templates, and for workflows, rather than having to do plugins, you have to do the add plugin, and it inherits from the base class and so on. For a workflow you can just highlight workflow activity class. I mean, I'll just show what the bare one looks like. Just quickly give it a dummy name. Obviously I won't be actually publishing this, just put some rubbish in there. That actually generates this empty workflow class library. It's got various using statements. It's already implemented the code activity class library. It's got in the execute method they've already initialized the tracing service and the context and so on. So it's a good starting point, and then you've got this to do, and that's where you'd enter your business logic. But I've obviously already done some work on this to prove the process. Let me just delete that, and I'll also need to clean up the register file because it will have added down the bottom. Let's put this extra row in. So if that's not present now because I've deleted the assembly, we'd get an error when deploying. So this is my one. I've done this survey question. Obviously I've added the additional using system.link, because just further down when I walk you through it, you'll see that I'm using link statements. That also applies to this plugin. I've added in the additional system.link, so just so you're aware, if you start to do this whilst trying to follow the video, although I'm going fairly quickly because it's pre-existing code that I've worked on last night, you'd get underscores here on the IntelliSense if you hadn't referenced the system.link, and it obviously wouldn't then carry on, and the IntelliSense wouldn't work on the next part when you start to build the queries. But back to the survey question workflow assembly. So in the execute method, it starts under the to do here in the try block. So I've declared an entity very similar to you've seen obviously on the plugin, but also an entity reference. Now the reason for that is on the create of a question or the modification of a question, we're on the two fields we've selected, what's passed in as part of the context in the target would be an entity. When you delete a record, what gets passed in as part of the context is an entity reference to the historic record. So you have the entity, well, they'll have the type name of the entity, so the FSO underscore question would be the entity name, and it will have the GUID, but obviously at that point the record has been deleted. By the time the workflow is triggered, the record's been deleted, any associations have been deleted, so you haven't got an entity to work with, you've only got this entity reference. So I do those basic checks, and if it contains target and it's of type entity, I cast the input parameter into an entity late bound type, and if it's an entity reference type, that gets, so here, that gets cast into that entity ref variable. So then I've got two pieces of code, one obviously to do with if it's the create or update of the question. So I do a check to see if this is no longer null, because it will have passed into this element where it is an entity and populated that variable with an actual entity reference type rather than a null that it was initialized with. So it will then process this section of code. So the first thing I do is to retrieve the actual question that is within this entity. So we've modified a particular question in the workflow, that's the trigger, but if we've only modified one value and it's triggered on sort of update, The only thing that the entity that's passed in here would contain, that's in the input parameter, would only contain the modified value. So I'm just doing, because this is all asynchronous and it's after everything's actually been written to the database, I'm just using the standard service.retrieve to retrieve the question and retrieve all columns. So this column set true. Obviously the reason I've done that full namespace is because I haven't actually declared a using statement, but I could add that in a using above and then just reference it as column set, which is probably a little bit cleaner. And then all I do is that in that retrieve, because that returns an entity, which is a late bound type, I put on the end this toEntity FSO question, which will create this early bound FSO question type. So I hope that makes sense. So on the create or the update of a new question record, this piece of code will trigger and retrieve that question from the database, all columns for it. I then instantiate the organization service context. I retrieve all accounts that are, so that particular question will be related to a survey profile. So if I show you what I'm talking about. So for instance, favorite color, if I open it, this question, if I were to modify it to favorite, I don't know, favorite engine size, it's got a relationship back to a particular survey. And, oh, sorry, wrong button. And that's what I'm retrieving in this first link statement. So I'm finding any accounts that are related to that survey profile for that question. So the survey, i.e. that question I'm modifying, which is the favorite color, is related to the survey about cars. So I want to know any accounts that are related to that survey about cars. I then retrieve all the questions that are part of that survey. And then this is the part where I then iterate through each account. So I hope people are following this. I iterate through each account, and one of the first things I do for the first account is retrieve all of their response questions. So we've got the survey, all the accounts that we're interested in. So if I've assigned that survey about cars to 2 accounts, this will contain the 2 account records. I've retrieved all the questions that comprise the survey about cars, so I know if there's 2, 3, 4 questions within it. Then I need to know for the first, as I go through each account, retrieve their copy of the questions for that particular account. So the first question, the CRM demo account, I want to know all their responses. I then go through the questions that are part of that survey. So if there's 3 questions in there, I iterate through the questions, and I'm looking to see if the customer in their responses already has that question. So if it was a new question added, this wouldn't return a count. So this lambda expression, where I'm looking up if the source question is equal to the question that's we're iterating over. If the customer already has that question, obviously I need to update it. So I hope that's making some sense. So yeah, if the customer already has that question, I then retrieve the compare the text of the question. So if I change the wording, I'm comparing. So this is the question I've just changed. Has the wording changed to what the customer's wording is? So this obviously complex looking. This dot where is just obviously to retrieve the matching source question to the question we're processing over, and then the first or default just retrieves, because this where could retrieve multiple responses. It shouldn't do in our instance, but it would ordinarily or could ordinarily. And then we're taking the FSO question property and comparing it. So this is the customer's question, so that would be favorite color. If I've just modified the question from favorite color to favorite engine size or something, they wouldn't match, so I then would need to update the text to equal what it's been modified to, and then do the standard update object and pass in the customer's survey response, which is this is this whole thing is the customer survey response. It looks quite complicated, but it isn't really. That's just returning me a single record with the first or default from that where method. And otherwise, if the count, so if basically if the customer doesn't already have that question, I'm adding it. So if it's the create that triggered the workflow and a new question got added to the survey, this section of code will trigger, and that just basically adds a new response, defines the question text, sets the source question back to the that related lookup you saw, and then associates it to the account, and then adds the object. Then the next bit, once we've iterated through all the accounts and each question for each account, is I do a sort of cleanup, which I don't think is particularly relevant, but I do that in reverse. So basically I take the responses of the customer, comparing them to see, so this is basically to try and get rid of any orphaned records. So if on that particular client, if they, so this is part of the for each account, so as it gets, after it's done the individual questions, it goes through that particular account's responses, their survey responses, that's their copy of the questions. If they don't exist on the questions that are part of the survey now, it deletes them. So if there were 4 questions on the survey and the account's actually got 5 somehow, through whatever means, I mean hopefully it should never happen, it would delete the 5th question, and then it will, at the very end, after all these, it'll do a save change which commits both these survey response updates and additions and the deletions. So I hope that made a bit of sense. It might sink in a little bit better once I actually show you it in action. Then this final section here is to do with if it's a deletion. So that was all to do with if there's an entity retrieved, i.e. a create triggered the workflow or an update of the question triggered the workflow. That section of code will have been implemented. If it's a delete, my thinking for this was, again, instantiate the organization service context, but as I previously stated a few minutes ago, because once the delete's triggered and you pass in this entity reference with a GUID, the main database operation has already actually deleted the record, so any lookups or any associations will already have been broken, and so you won't have any means of actually searching for that GUID because it won't exist in the system anymore. So what I'm doing is for it's a sort of a system-wide cleanse really, which is a bit brutal, but it would function. You might want to modify this, but I'm basically saying if a question gets deleted, it will leave survey responses in the system. Let's just dig one out. So this survey response here, which is related to demo account, what it would mean is if that question got deleted, that favourite colour question, this would be empty. So you've actually got a sort of orphaned survey response. Although it's related to the account, there's no relationship back to the parent question for favourite colour. So if this favourite colour question obviously doesn't exist now, so this would never get updated, or it's sort of broken that link. So my theory was to basically, if the source question is null, it's an orphaned record, so I'll just retrieve any orphaned survey responses where there's not a source question and delete them. So iterate through them, do the delete object method to track it in the context, and save the changes. So hopefully that bit makes some sense as well. Otherwise it was going to mean having to do a plugin that's triggered on a delete of a question, but that may have possibly timed out because at the moment I've got a tiny record set. But if it was a delete of a question and you had 20,000 accounts on the same profile, there's a real possibility it would never complete, and it would then roll back all the transactions, and then you'd never be able to delete a question. So that's all published as well. Obviously going back to, just close that, back to the processes. So that's published, and it's part of this question workflow, and I was able to then select it as a step within the workflow designer. So that survey question is here. So I'll just do you a couple of demos. So if I go back to accounts, we've already put this demo. Oh, we blanked that one, didn't we? So if I put that back to survey about cars and save it, we can see the plugins triggered, and that's populated the two favorite colors and petrol or diesel or LPG. So I could again put some responses back in these. Black, save and close, and they prefer petrol cars. So if I go down to the next account, that's also survey about cars. So again, I could put a couple of dummy responses in. So they like blue cars, and in this instance they're interested in diesel cars. Okay, so we've got two accounts, which I can then go to the settings and look at the survey profile. So if I look at the survey about cars, on the left hand side under the accounts relationship, I can see that there's the two accounts that are related to this survey about cars, and also those are the two questions. So I could now add, for instance, a new question, which now this will trigger the create part of the workflow. So how many seats, for instance? If I save that, obviously if I click on the workflow area, we should see in a second, depending on how quickly my asynchronous service picks up the job, so it could take a minute or two, but we'll see that process appear within here in a few seconds. We'll process through that code and obviously add the additional question to the related accounts that are related to. So this question is related to survey about cars. It will query any accounts that are related to that, and then obviously add the additional question in. Sorry, my asynchronous service is a bit slow. Let me just go to system jobs if I can see the. Oh, so it's in progress now. So if I fly back to the question, that should now be on here. So that's succeeded. So we can close the question. And if I go back to, have I got anything open? The survey profile. So we've now got three questions. I've just added the additional how many seats. If I go to the accounts and click on one of them, we should see. Yeah. So now we've got the additional how many seats. If I go down to the next account in that list, again when the grid refreshes, we've got another how many seats, which now we can obviously populate that. So he's interested. McLaren F1 is interested in a two-seater black petrol car, and again the next account, he's interested in a four-seater. Now if I show you obviously modifying that question, so let me close the accounts. I'm on the survey profile, survey about cars, because I was viewing the accounts through the relationship there. I can go to the questions and possibly something, I don't know, how many wheels. I mean, you'll see probably one of the dangers of modifying the question itself is that if you've got pre-existing answers, do you clear the answers related to this question if it gets modified, or do you just allow it to propagate the change and risk that the answer that you've previously given is actually irrelevant now? So from changing from how many seats to how many wheels, if I save that, again we should see the workflow hopefully a bit quicker this time, because it's the asynchronous service is awake and the plugins cache, or the workflow assemblies cache, so that's succeeded. So I can close the question, go back to the accounts, open demo account, and now instead of saying how many seats where we'd answered 2, it's now how many wheels, so now it's become a motorbike. So again, that's sort of what I was just saying. It could be a bit bad practice to actually change the wording of the question unless it was just, I mean, obviously that's changing the entire context of the question. So it's a bit misleading what I've done. I can also show you, obviously, if I delete that whole question, so both that and you can see the other one have both changed to how many wheels. So now if I go to questions, tick that and delete the question. Okay, obviously I can't show you the workflow there because the question's gone, but I can show you in the system jobs. So that's just, yeah, 11:46, that's just done it. Back to the profile. So again, look at the two accounts that had that profile with the extra question. And we can see that how many wheels was it has disappeared. And again, on the next account, again, that's deleted again. So, I mean, I can show you that has actually cleared them out if I look at the database. So I look at the filtered view for the survey responses. We can see there should be only 4 rows. Filtered survey response. So there we go, we've got obviously various GUIDs and so on, but you can see that there's only the 2 accounts in there, and then the 2 questions, favourite colour for each, and petrol, diesel or LPG for each, and then the responses are in there. I think that covers off everything Brian had requested. That covers all elements of the coding. So if there's any queries or questions regarding this, obviously feel free to file them either on the YouTube clip or where I posted the source code. You could always go onto the forum and create a new thread or something, or I might create a new thread and post in there, and obviously we can have a discussion via that, which is sometimes a little bit easier to type in a forum where there's threads than on YouTube, but I'm happy with either, so whatever you guys prefer. But thanks very much for watching again. Hopefully that's answered what you're looking for. I'll post the source code again via the forum. I will probably create a thread for this particular video, and you guys can then, I'll post a link on YouTube and you can go to the forum to grab it. But thanks again, and obviously any requests or comments, feel free to post them, and speak to you soon. Bye.